Welcome to the 2022 Legislative Team Kickoff webinar for Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy. My name is Aaron Klemz, and I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at MCEA. And
I'm Andrea Lovoll. I am the Legislative Associate at MCEA.
And Andrea and I are going to be walking through what our agenda is at the legislature this year. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the tools that we have on our website and other tools that are available to you to help you advocate for clean water, for climate action and environmental justice at the Minnesota legislature. We're going to talk a little bit about what we saw in the first week at the legislature, and it's certainly going to be a quick and intense session, only lasting a few months, but we're already seeing some of the themes of the session develop. And lastly, we'll get to your questions. We'll answer as many questions as we can about either our agenda or what you're interested in the legislature. Feel free to put those questions as they occur to you in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. And like I said, in the last third, or the third period, as we like to call it in a hockey game, we'll get to your questions at that time. So thank you so much for putting them in there. So thanks for taking your time out of your busy schedule. We love doing these noon webinars. It's really important for us to connect with you so that you can learn the work that we're doing and the work that your support makes possible at MCEA. So first of all, thanks to our donors and supporters. We really appreciate that work, and it allows us to do stuff like have multiple staff that are at the legislature, making sure that we are pushing for clean water and climate action. It allows us to hire contract lobbyists to push some of these priorities over the finish line. So we're really excited about the resources that we can bring to bear because of your support. Please make a donation if you haven't already at mncenter.org/donate-MCEA. As I said, we're going to break this up into three parts. First, I'm going to walk through some of MCEA's priorities. I'll have a few slides, but not too many. I don't want to subject you to another PowerPoint presentation. Andrea is going to talk about some of the resources that she's been leading the development of over the last several months so that folks have more information about how to have conversations with your legislators about the environmental issues you care about. And then we'll come to your questions and answers. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen. And you know, of course, this is always fraught with danger, but we'll give this a go anyway. And it actually seems to work. So what you're seeing on your screen is a list of what we divided into what we call our proactive priorities. So these are bills that we are advocating for, either as the lead organization or as part of a coalition. And then we have a number of defensive priorities. And that's really important because MCEA is one of the groups at the Capitol that's always keeping an eye on, well, we'll just call them shenanigans, attempts to undermine Minnesota's foundational environmental laws. As you know, MCEA is a public interest law firm and an advocacy group. And so what that means is that we need to have good tools in the law for our lawyers to use when they go to court. And also frequently, when we win in court, we end up having to defend those laws from attack as folks who've lost those lawsuits attempt to use the legislative route to change the very laws that we won the court case on. So we'll talk a little bit more about why that's important in a minute. But first, some of our proactive priorities, and if you've been following our work over the last several years, you know that the top bullet here, the Next Generation Climate Act, has been a priority for us since the last session. You may know that in 2007, we passed the Next Generation Energy Act in Minnesota, which at the time was a bipartisan, trailblazing effort to put clear guidelines and targets in our climate pollution reduction strategy. And Minnesota hasn't really been living up to both those goals, but also the goals should have shifted as science has come in. So we were most recently at the Conference of the Parties conference in Glasgow, Scotland. And right before that was released a number of new scientific studies that show that we need to be making even faster progress in reducing our climate pollution in order to avoid the worst impacts of the climate crisis. And so the Next Generation Climate Act would put those new scientific standards into Minnesota statute, so that we would be pursuing the same goals for our climate reduction, for our climate pollution strategies the rest of the world is. That bill passed last year in the House. And when it was part of the House's budget package, we were really proud to see it move that far. This session, our goal is to get it to have a hearing in the Senate. We think it's really important that the Minnesota Senate have a hearing on this bill so they can understand the science that underlies this and the need for changing our targets so that we can align our work with the rest of the world. So that's one of our biggest priorities this session. The second one that may be relatively new to some folks, but you've probably heard about it, is a smart salting bill. This is a bill that would give businesses and salt applicators like landscaping companies credit for taking classes in best management practices to avoid the overuse of salt. I'm sure if you're like me, recently you've passed some kind of big pile of salt on the sidewalk where it's almost performative, right? Look at this big pile of salt, I must be doing something to protect you. The reality is that's not an effective use of salt. And it's also really bad for our water. 1 teaspoon of salt can permanently contaminate 5 gallons of water. And for our lakes, we just can't have that. We already have lakes in Minnesota. For example, Brownie Lake in Minneapolis, which is next to High 394, has so much salt in it right now that the lake no longer turns over. And that's an important aspect of lake health. So we're excited to be working with the Stop Oversalting Coalition and a number of other coalition partners to try to get this bill over the finish line. It's been heard in several sessions before in 2018 and 2019, has broad bipartisan support, and is an example of a bill that we should be able to get over the finish line, even in a split control legislative year like we have here in Minnesota. I'll be a little bit quicker on the rest of these. The third bill that you see there is that in the last couple of years, there's been some negotiations between MCEA, the mining industry, and a number of people who've lived near proposed mining leases to increase the notifications to nearby landowners and public land users, which is all of us, when there is a new mineral lease proposed. And that notification process has been improved, but it needs to have they need to have the ability in statute in order to bill mining companies for the cost of that enhanced notification. And we continue to work on that bill to try to get that over the finish line. Fourth, you know about the lottery funds and the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund. We've been a watchdog and a guardian for that fund to make sure that it's spent appropriately. It's also coming to the end of its life. It needs to be reauthorized. Otherwise, in a couple of years, the lottery will no longer fund the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund. So we're working in a coalition with other groups to try to get this issue paid attention to at the legislature this year, and hopefully get it on the ballot. Ultimately, it needs to be on the ballot as a constitutional amendment, which is a complicated process, but one that we think needs to be done. The vast majority of people support this. We did a poll on this question earlier this year and found that nearly 80% of people thought that we should either keep the level of funding or increase it for the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund from the lottery. A couple other quick bullets. The Frontline Communities Protection Act is an environmental justice bill that we've been working in coalition with a number of groups on. It's going to get a hearing soon in the Minnesota House again. We're hopeful to get more attention paid to environmental justice in the Minnesota Senate this session as well. A number of bills that Andrea will talk about in a moment that are coming up in the next week or so on the PFAS problem. These are those perfluorochemicals that are permanent contaminants, or what they call forever chemicals. Minnesota recently just banned the use of PFAS in food packaging, which is a really important step forward. And there's a hearing coming up next week on a number of other consumer products where PFAS is used. And lastly, we've been part of the Prove It First coalition that's been working to try to improve Minnesota sulfide mining laws. And that continues to be a focus for that coalition. They're trying to get a hearing on this bill as well in the Minnesota House. Lastly, our defensive priorities. I mentioned before about why we defend these laws. Here's what we're defending. First of all, the Limbo Creek win that we had at the Minnesota Court of Appeals has now been appealed to the Minnesota Supreme Court. But meanwhile, a number of counties and other agricultural interests are trying to undermine the public waters protections that are in Minnesota statute. And we're working to organize all of Minnesota's environmental conservation, hunting and fishing groups to try to fight back against those attempts to undermine Minnesota's public waters law. You may recall that we worked very hard and fought to get the environmental review documents to actually look at greenhouse gas pollution finally. We expect that there will be an effort at the legislature to undermine that work. And so we're working to defend that win at the legislature as well. And lastly, we're always making sure to defend Minnesota's bedrock environmental laws, Minnesota Environmental Policy Act, Minnesota Environmental Rights Act, and other laws like that. Now I'm going to turn it over to Andrea to talk a little bit about some of the work that we've been doing between the two sessions in 2021 and 2022 to reach out to new people and to give you new resources to work with your legislators.
Yeah, so the first thing I'm going to talk about is this environmental policy primer, which is a project that's really close to my heart. I have a background in education. I was a teacher for a long time. And one of the things that I found when I started joining the advocacy community is how inaccessible some of the information is, trying to get information about what the laws are that we try to protect. So I worked on this policy primer with a number of our legal staff and our program directors, and then also a local artist, illustrator, designer, Magdalena Mora. to come up with this policy primer to educate the public and also new legislators on what our environmental policies laws are that we try to protect, and also what we try to push at the legislature for shaping policy. I have the little booklet here, so you can access this online, but I'll walk you through kind of what this booklet does and how you can use it. So the first half of this is about what the issues are that we are involved in at the legislature. So you'll see that there's climate and energy and to start with, and there's a policy highlight on the Next Generation Climate Act, which, like we mentioned before, is a big thing that we're pushing this legislative session. That's the first part of it, and then we have sections on environmental justice and water and toxic chemicals. And then finally, we have a regional highlight on northeastern Minnesota. That's kind of the first part of this environmental policy primer. The second is there's actually some descriptions and very easy to understand diagrams for the laws that we try to protect in Minnesota. And these are the laws that help us do our litigation work at MCEA. These are the bedrock laws that we try to protect at the legislature. So again, that is available on our website. There's a couple different places you can find it. I think somebody put it in the chat. So that's really great. So how to work through this document or how to use this document. First, read it yourself, become informed. This is meant to be a resource so that you can easily talk to your representatives, your representatives and your senators and the governor's office on the issues that matter to you in regards to environmental work. So there's some good background here, gives you exactly the kind of information that you would need to confidently talk to your legislators. The other thing is it can be a tool for you to share with your community to get them engaged in the legislative process, which is a really critical thing that we're trying to work on at MCEA, is getting more people involved in the legislative process and to advocate for environmental work. Because if there's anything that's the most powerful is that it's constituents connecting with their legislators. It's an incredibly powerful tool. So yeah, in addition to this legislative, this environmental policy primer, we also have a number of other resources available on our website that you can use throughout the session. We have fact sheets and we have a bill tracker, and those are all available on that website as well, which can be used for the same types of advocacy work that the primer can. I also want to talk a little bit about the events that we're going to be holding this session. So this is another thing that we've been working on that I'm really excited about. So we are working on some events. We just had one at Rochester to connect local communities to their local decision makers so that we can get a conversation started on issues that matter to that community. So we just had an event in Rochester called Rochester is Ready. And we had a panel put together with a local physician who is an anesthesiologist and interested in climate issues, as well as the coordinator for the Department of Sustainability at the city of Rochester. And we talked about what happens in Rochester with climate change, how it affects the community, and what the community's impact is on climate change. That was the start of some other events that we're going to do. So stay tuned on events that might be coming to your district that will affect your local community. We'll also be doing a series of legislative webinars this session. This is just the kickoff of it. The next one's going to be on February 15th to talk more in depth about the SALT bill. Stay tuned for more of those webinars. We're going to have them every couple of weeks through the end of the session. So I'm going to hand it back over to Aaron.
As Andrea noted, like we're planning to do these as webinars for now. Of course, we're paying attention to the COVID situation like everyone else is. Currently, the legislature, just as a quick note on that, there's very different approaches in the Minnesota House and the Senate when it comes to how they're conducting their business, which has made things more complicated for our work, but also for constituents and citizens who just want to be involved in the process. As of right now, the Minnesota House is really basically doing a remote session. There will be people in the chamber, there will be people at committee hearings, but mostly it will be done through Zoom, similar to what we're doing today. The Minnesota Senate has adopted a much different approach. They are not requiring masking in the chamber. They're not really accommodating remote at all. Instead, they are encouraging folks to come to the Senate. But at the same time, it's also not possible to get to all aspects of the Senate building, which makes things a little bit more complex. Obviously, given the situation with the Omicron variant and everything else, things are they're very fluid. And it's possible that by the end of the session, it'll be safe and be reasonable for folks to get together in person at the legislature itself. And we'll continue to keep an eye on that as we go through this. But as everyone is, we're trying to figure out this as we go along and do what we can to keep people safe and also give people access to the government. I think that's one of the challenges has been really over the last 2 or 3 years is how do you make sure that folks can have their say, can reach their representatives and their senators and be able to have their say on what they're doing if they're not able to be physically present in the same space. And so a lot of the tools that Andrea was just talking about are available on our website and give you some of the tools to reach out to your legislators. Sometimes we'll do action alerts as well that'll focus specific attention on an issue and make it really easy for you. But please do use all those resources as you see fit to try to reach out to your legislator. I wanted to spend a minute though talking about some of the other unique characteristics of this legislative session besides the fact that the ongoing COVID pandemic has made it more complicated. It's also Minnesota, until last year, we were the only state with a split control of the legislature where there's different parties that control different bodies. We're no longer the only one. So sorry, Minnesota exceptionalists, you're gonna have to share the stage with Virginia and Alaska now. But at the same time, it is a real challenge because there are radically different policy priorities for the two bodies. We were just before this session on another legislative kind of opener session that was put on the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits, and folks are civil and of course talking about similar issues, but in very, very different ways. And on the environment, this has become a real wedge issue and made it very difficult to find common ground between the Republican-led Senate and the Democratic-led House. And so that's one of the reasons why the SALT liability bill is one of our priorities this year is we really want to demonstrate that it's possible, even in this incredibly polarized and difficult partisan environment, for us to find common agreement and common ground and get something done together. I don't think anyone thinks that reducing the liability for slip and fall injuries for SALT application is going to be the end all be all of the salt and chloride pollution problem, but it is one area where there is a lot of agreement amongst a number of the parties. And so we're really hopeful to get that over the finish line. We really thank Sue Neeson and Sapa Versalti and the group of citizens that started that process a couple of years ago. And we're hopeful that we can be an example of how to make bipartisan change happen on environmental policy at the Minnesota legislature this session. Another thing that we saw in the last couple of years is that we noted that there have been a couple of models of effective ways of making policy. One of those is to focus on toxic chemicals. This is something that we've been able to reach bipartisan agreement about. One of the earlier victories was about trichloroethylene, or TCE. Minnesota was the first state to ban the use of this toxic solvent that's one of the biggest groundwater contaminants in the state of Minnesota. And in large measure, this was made possible by a number of constituents in White Bear Lake who, after the water gremlin case broke, didn't stop at just winning at the facility that affected their community, but decided they didn't want anyone else in the state to suffer the same problems. And so they fought to ban the very chemical that was a problem for their community and won after several years of work. Just last session, we saw that you can ban PFAS, perfluorochemicals, in food packaging. And now you're seeing a number of other bills pop up that will ban the use of these chemicals in a variety of different consumer products. And that seems to be a model that can work, and we're hopeful to see some more progress in that area as well. The third big thing is financial resources. As you have heard from many people, I'm sure seen on the news, there is a $7.7 billion surplus. That number's a little bit deceiving, just to be clear, because Minnesota's laws prohibit the use of inflation when you calculate these surpluses. And so, as everyone also knows, there's a lot of inflation happening right now, but we're not accounting for that in the way that we think about the surplus, quote unquote, that we have. And there's, of course, a whole host of needs. whether it's in education, healthcare, or a whole variety of other areas. There's a lot of competition for these are not extra dollars, these are actually needed dollars. And we know that there will be a lot of pressure to spend money that's coming from the federal government as well, in terms of infrastructure spending. And our goal is to make sure that that spending is on bonding and infrastructure is done in ways that adapt to the climate crisis and actually mitigate climate pollution as opposed to add to it. If we just spend that infrastructure money on adding additional lanes of traffic on our highways, and we only pump out more CO2 because of that, we will be losing a huge opportunity. And so our goal is to be a watchdog on those dollars as well, to make sure that we're spending it in ways that are consistent with our obligations to mitigate the climate crisis and hopefully adapt to it as well. So we expect to see some really interesting stuff, but also I just want to say a couple of quick words. This is supposed to be a bonding year. In other words, the primary business of the legislature is supposedly to pass a bonding bill. There's already proposals for up to $3.5 billion in bonding. We oftentimes see large numbers at the outset of the session to get shrunk down near the end, but there will definitely be a back and forth between the House and the Senate about the bonding proposals, which are long-term borrowing for usually like something like longer term projects. It's basically the equivalent of a mortgage, right? If you're thinking about your personal finances. And so you would look for projects that fit that. And then the other thing that we expect to see is a short session. This is the second year of a 2-year session. It's only 4 months. And that means that it's very difficult to get bills through the process in that short amount of time. And lastly, I would be remiss for not noting this. The Minnesota legislature is passing a very, very small number of bills. I believe last session they passed only 27 bills the entire session, which is a record low. I think it was Senator John Marty who published an op-ed piece about 1.5 years ago that said that eventually there will be only one bill that is passed every year by the Minnesota legislature and everything will go into it. I don't think he's that far off. It may not be just one bill, but it won't be a very large number. And so a lot of the priorities that we're pursuing, and for that matter, a lot of our opponents are pursuing, will end up being folded into some kind of bigger bill, whether it's a supplemental budget bill or the bonding bill or some other kind of omnibus policy bill. You'll likely see big collections of policy get lumped together and voted together as a group, as opposed to individual items being voted on separately. And that's a long continuing trend, but it's gotten to the point now where it's become almost the dominant way that policymaking happens in Minnesota. So we expect to see more of that again this session as well. And we're adapting to that. We're making sure that our bills are both being heard as standalone bills, but also that they're ready to be included into bigger packages of bills later down the road. And we saw a lot of this stuff starting to pop up this session right away. So I'm going to turn it over to Andrea, who's been watching the legislature really closely for the first week, to give you a little update about what we saw in the first week.
Yeah, so it's been a really busy first week. Session started on Monday officially. And we have already been involved in a lot of testimony at the legislature and talking with legislators in one-on-one meetings, and meeting with our coalition partners to advance particular legislation. So we've done a lot already because we're moving fast. So I want to highlight a couple of things that we've been involved in specifically. The first is we submitted some testimony for the Transportation Committee on how best to spend the federal dollars coming in for transportation. Transportation is the largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions, largest sector in the state. And so that has a lot of potential for legislation that would help with climate change. So we are encouraging the legislature to consider solutions like mode shifting, so changing the way that people travel and reduce the number of miles traveled, so that we can reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions emitted by the transportation sector. The transportation sector emissions have only fallen 7% since 2005, and that is way below the goal from the Next Generation Energy Act and nowhere near where we need to be. So this is an issue that we're going to be considerably involved in talking about how to spend those dollars. You can find that testimony available on our website if you're interested. The other issue is PFAS. This is a growing concern, something that is getting more attention. As Erin mentioned, we were able to pass a ban on PFAS in food packaging. And Representative Wozlowick has introduced a couple of other bills, which we'll be supporting this next week, in banning PFAS in cosmetics, in ski wax, and in cookware. For those of you who are not really familiar with PFAS, I'll give you a quick little intro into it, but we'll talk more in depth at a webinar later on regarding PFAS. So it's a forever chemical, meaning that it does not degrade. Once it's in the environment, it's there. And it leads to a number of really concerning health issues, including fetal development and reproductive health, cognitive delays in children, and an increased risk of cancers and other comorbidities. So it's a really concerning chemical that is pretty much found everywhere. And it's used in all kinds of products, from firefighting and fire-resistant chemicals to waterproofing chemicals, cosmetics, and cookware, like in Teflon products. And it's really prevalent, and right now it's not required to be disclosed on products. So there's a number of issues that we need to be working on so that we're more aware of the harms of PFAS and getting it out of our environment. So like I mentioned, the last session, we had a successful ban of PFAS in food packaging. This session, we're working on cookware, cosmetics, and ski wax, among some other getting attention onto PFAS through other ways. So we'll be talking a lot more about PFAS this session. In terms of other toxic chemicals, we're also involved in lead. So there was a hearing on lead this past week to replace service lines, residential lines that have lead in them, as well as banning lead toxic ammunition, which we have been supportive of in the past, and continue to be supportive of. There are some federal dollars coming in specifically for lead line replacement. So we are excited to see that money coming in. There's a lot of work that needs to be done on lead and done properly. So we'll be paying attention to that issue as well. So other things that have happened this week, there was also a climate justice hearing in talking about Representative Lee's cumulative impacts bill, which we are also very involved in with the Frontline Community Protection Coalition. And so we're working with them, taking their lead on how to bring environmental justice to communities in Minnesota. And then finally, we're also involved in a more non-traditional bill that we haven't been involved in before, which is regarding the landfill fund. Representative Richardson has brought a bill forward to replenish the funds to close landfills properly, which is actually a PFAS issue because landfills leak PFAS into our waterways and our groundwater. And if they're not closed properly, that is a worse problem. So we are supportive of Representative Richardson's bill to do that, and we testified on that as well. In terms of everything else, there's a lot more happening the next couple of weeks. Lots happening on climate and on toxic chemicals and water. And we'll keep you posted on things that happen with newsletters and with webinars and the best ways that we can communicate to you. So my best advice is to keep updated on what we're doing, is to sign up for our newsletters, because we keep you informed on what's happening at the legislature in good detail. And we also let you know about events that are coming up to learn more about in-depth topics like PFAS, or like the SALT bill, or like the Next Generation Climate Act. So if you're interested in those events throughout session, please make sure that you sign up for our newsletters. That's also the best way to get access to our action alerts. So to be involved in the legislature, definitely sign up for the newsletter and to get our action alerts. And I'm handing back to Erin for the last bit here.
Yeah. I was going to quickly share my screen again, and well, I guess not. No, never mind. But all the links have been placed in the chat. But I just wanted to make people aware, basically, as we do testimony or as we engage on particular bills, we'll take a position, we'll put it in our bill tracker. So if you have a bill that you've heard about or you're interested in, go to our website, and if you don't see it there, let us know. We'll be happy to take a look and make sure that if we have any resources, we can share it. Our goal is to get them in your hands and not to hoard them for ourselves. They don't do any good if you're not being able to access them. One other thing that hasn't been mentioned as well is that the most up to the minute stuff is usually on our social media accounts. So our Twitter account in particular, we actually will like live tweet sometimes hearings that are important on issues that we really care about. So if you're a Twitter user, you can follow us at MCEA 1974. And why 1974? That was the year of our founding. So we're getting close to 50 years at MCEA. I noticed there's a lot of questions in the chat. We're going to start to get to those now, but if you haven't put your question in the Q&A section, please do so, and we'll start to go through those and answer as many of them as we can in the last 20 minutes or so we have together here. So I'm going to start with a question from L. Cox. I'm sorry, I don't know who L is, but says, can the mineral mining lease notification to surrounding landowners also include any mining whatsoever, such as aggregate or sand? First of all, that's a good question because Minnesota's mining laws are complex and they're different depending on what kind of mining we're talking about. The specific kind of leases that are contemplated to be reimbursed and have more notification, in this case, are non-ferrous mineral leases, and they involve gold, manganese, copper, nickel, anything other than iron, but also not aggregate. Generally, the aggregate stuff is fairly well noticed in general, although not always. Unfortunately, it usually means they publish like just a notice in the paper. But I think you're right. There's definitely some room to improve the notification process. One thing that happened in this process of negotiating with the DNR was that they agreed to send a statewide press release every time they put up a new non-ferrous mineral lease for consideration. And that alone has probably made more of a difference than any of the other parts of that notification package put together, because the media has covered it. You might have heard, I mean, I was on the radio talking about these manganese leases being proposed near Emily, Minnesota on NPR. That wouldn't have happened if they hadn't gotten that press release from the DNR and had that information in front of them. So there's definitely room to improve that, but this bill would only address non-ferrous mineral leases. Let's see. You want to take this one from Carrie about only chloride? I mean, so about asking, it's a question about the smart salting bill. Is it only about controlling chloride and not other salts?
So road salt has chloride pollution. It contains chloride, which is the polluting factor in road salt. So we're specifically talking about the type of salt that is a de-icer, like what uses chloride. So yes, I think is the answer to your question, that it does only address that. So there are some other salts that are not that don't necessarily contain the chloride issue.
There are some alternative salts that are used to melt ice and snow. You know, especially if you have pets, for example, you might see like pet safe salts. They're a different kind of salt. It's not chloride. So the smart salting bill looks at a variety of salt products that are used to apply for ice and snow removal or ice and snow control. And so not all of them are only chloride salts. There are a couple of other ones like magnesium. There's a couple of magnesium salts that are involved too. The primary issue for our lakes though is chloride pollution. And that includes things like your water softeners. You know, so there's a lot of salt that's used in water softening. That's also being separately addressed through a number of other legislative initiatives. Tess asks, isn't the state already behind on meeting our existing climate goals?
Yes.
The answer is yes, we are.
Yes, we are.
The most recent data shows that we did not reach our 2020 goal, and we are not likely to reach the next goal either, unfortunately.
Which means that we do still have a little bit of time to make up for that, but we got to move fast. So we have to move the goals because we didn't adequately address the problem.
The Next Generation Climate Act not only changes the goals, though, but it also requires that the state take action that's consistent with those goals, right? And that's important. That's kind of an open-ended thing, but it's also really important. It'll be the first time the states will have actually committed to doing stuff that's consistent with the goals, right? Right now we have a bunch of goals and no requirement that folks act in ways consistent with them. And you can see a number of the actions that we've taken recently on line 3 and elsewhere are not consistent with those goals. So there's two parts that will change that. One is we actually do need to include some interim and accelerated goals for progress. So the biggest one would be that in 2030, we would set a goal of a 45% reduction of our greenhouse gas emissions. Like and as Tess noted, we're behind. Like, I think it's fair to say that setting more ambitious goals alone and then doing nothing to try to achieve them will not get us out of the climate crisis. No one thinks that that will happen. However, it's also really important for us to be realistic and be telling people what is actually going to be needed for us to avoid the worst impacts of the climate crisis. So the way that scientists talk about this is the ways, how are we going to stay below 1.5 degrees centigrade warming globally? And that's what these science-based targets are set at. If we were to achieve them, we would be able to hopefully keep our climate at 1.5 degrees warming, which would still provide catastrophic impacts for a large number of people. But if we go much beyond that, we could very much risk making our planet unlivable for humanity, period. And that's really what the risk is here. The Earth will go on. We're not really sure whether humans will be part of that unless we find a way to get our act together. Someone asked, an anonymous attendee, I'm sorry, that's fine, you guys don't need to say your names, but like during the Dayton administration, there was action that required a 50-foot barrier around waterways to filter out runoff. Is this effective to prevent salts or pollutants from entering waterways? Good question. So the 50-foot barrier or the 50-foot buffer zone around public waters is a really important water protection move. Mostly it's for phosphorus and nitrates, though, for pollutants that are about nutrient pollution that are coming off of agricultural fields. That's the primary benefit for those buffers. It can also be effective in preventing other salts from other pollutants from entering waterways, but its primary purpose was for nutrient pollution. I will say a little bit about this that's important too, which is that when we said we were defending the public waters laws in Minnesota, one of the important distinctions here is that public waters that are on the public waters inventory have to have that 50-foot buffer around them to protect their water quality. And that was an important innovation and an important step forward. Now there's a lot of work that on our part and other part and at the DNR to try to make it so that this public waters inventory is accurate, that it actually reflects all the waters that need to be protected. And that's part of the reason why that's on our defensive priorities list as well.
There was a question that just came in from Wallace that I'd like to answer.
Oh, sure. Where did it go? Oh, it might have been in the chat. Let's go over here.
Oh,
yeah, there we go.
Will there be anything for cities to address mitigation and adaptation to climate change? So that's where the Next Generation Climate Act comes in. So the Next Generation Energy Act was sort of a blueprint for how how cities could address and communities could address climate change. And a lot of cities like Rochester already use that as a blueprint for their own sustainability plans and plans to address climate change. So this would work in the same way that it would help cities have a blueprint for how they can address climate change in their own community and what targets that they need to achieve. So the best way, in my thought, that you can get your cities to be involved is first talk to your city officials about what the climate goals are that you want to see based on the science that you see from the Next Generation Climate Act. And then second, to get your representatives and your senators to hear the Next Generation Climate Act in the Senate.
Sounds great. I'm sorry, I'm looking through a number of these questions. There's some great questions in here. I also want to build off of what you were talking about in response to Wallace's question, which is that another thing that's important is that when cities do environmental review of proposals, one of the things that we're working really hard to do is to make sure that there's resources set aside to allow cities and other local units of government to make sure that climate mitigation and climate adaptation are included in whenever a new project is proposed. And that's some of the work that Amelia Voss has been doing with the Environmental Quality Board. And now there's a proposal to spend about $600,000 to give cities and other local units of government more resources to help them do better work on analyzing climate impacts from proposals in their area that they're doing an environmental study of. Jean asks a question, are we looking at moving us to an all EV driven transportation system? So first of all, electrifying everything is one of the quickest paths to getting to a carbon neutral future. I think that everyone knows that, but there's challenges there as well, right? All of these attempts to move us, if we were just to try to replace one for one everyone's single car that is driven on gas right now with a new car that was driven by lithium-ion batteries, that wouldn't really do it, would it? I mean, we need to change other things that are even more fundamental to our system. I noticed there's some other questions in the chat too about electric buses. And there were a number of proposals that came out last week from the Walz administration about spending some money on electric buses and electrification. I don't have the numbers in front of me right now, but there were a number of really positive proposals there. It's going to be a long slog. Luckily in Minnesota, we have set ourselves up for success with some of the charging infrastructure work that we've done through the VW settlement and other things. But at the same time, I think we also should focus not solely on getting to electrification, although that's an important tool in our toolbox, but also reducing vehicle miles traveled is really important. And that includes things like transit, includes the uses of like e-bikes, which are really amazing. To be perfectly honest, they use very little energy. They're not nearly as resources intensive as cars, and they're super fun to drive. Now it's 0 degrees outside today, so I wouldn't necessarily do it today. But at the same time, there are lots of different approaches we can take. And our goal is to get us to a future where people have a lot of options that are available to them, and they don't have to only be driving a car. Because I think if that's our only way of getting around, we'll never really reach that carbon neutral future that we need.
I think it's also worth noting that there is a lot of federal dollars coming in for EV infrastructure. And that's one of the things that was discussed at the transportation hearing in regards on how to spend that money coming in. School buses is one of them. I just saw that in chat. So yeah, school buses is one of those vehicle infrastructure, EV infrastructure solutions that's being looked at by the Transportation Committee.
Yeah, and I think also we have to keep in mind that there's also federal action that's happening at the same time, right? So just about a month ago, the new federal CAFE standards, these are auto efficiency standards, came out, and the federal government is targeting a 17 or 18% electric vehicle adoption rate by 2025, 2026. The major manufacturers such as GM are talking about going all electric by 2030. Right, so it's going to be there's a lot of work to make this very substantial industrial transition. But we're really optimistic that it's happening at the rate that it is, and frankly, and also that we're retiring coal plants at the rate that we're retiring them, so that we're not fueling electric vehicles with dirty coal electricity, but rather with clean renewable electricity instead. There was a question at the bottom that I really want to make sure to address, because someone asked, how do we influence our Senate leader, even if we don't live in his district, to at least allow hearings on these legislative issues? That's a great question. Here's one of the challenges is that senators and legislators like to hear from their constituents first. And oftentimes make it difficult for you to contact them if you're not in their district. And that's unfortunate, because some of the issues that they are responsible for have an impact beyond their district, right? And so one is, I think people's contact info is public. I would suggest gently that it's not a great idea to pick up the phone and scream at somebody's staffer and tell them to have hearings on things. I think instead that the better bet is to ask them nicely. I know that sounds lame, I get it. But I also think that letting your senator know that it's important is another way of getting that message to leaders of committees. So for example, the climate committee chair, or I'm sorry, the energy committee chair in the Senate, they don't call it the climate committee, is Senator Dave Senjum from Rochester. And Dave Senjum he's been deeply involved in clean energy for a very long time. Like, he has gone to Germany to study what they're doing over there in terms of renewable electricity. His commitment to clean energy is not in doubt. However, his committee is also not hearing bills like the Next Generation Climate Act. And that's concerning to us. And so we will actually, in the chat, we can put in a link to one of our action alerts right now, which asks you to ask your senator for a hearing. And we will think about ways to get that message directly to Senator Senjum, who is the key decider on whether his committee will hear the bill. But we would suggest talking to your senator first, because you have the most impact on them. They want to hear from you, especially during election year.
Well, and also don't assume that your legislator agrees with you and knows about it, because you would be surprised sometimes connecting to your legislator that they either don't know what you're talking about, or they might have some differing opinions on it. So don't assume that they agree with you when you think about your legislator and particular issues. If you want something done, you as the constituent have the power to say something about it and tell them your opinions and your thoughts.
All right, we're getting close to the end of time. I wanted to address a question that John Wells asked in the Q&A, because I think it's a really good way for us to maybe sum some of this up, which is, fighting climate change has long been lost in the partisan divide. Has the national experience with costly radical climate events yet begun to change our legislators' perception of the urgency to act? Do we need a big ad campaign to make the connection between flood and drought and our radically changed climate? I don't know, ad campaigns, I love ad campaigns. I'm an old communications person, so I'm excited about that. But I do want to say a few words about this partisan divide on climate. Because I think if you'd asked this question a couple of years ago, I would have said no. I would have said no, I don't think folks have really figured this out. But I do think that, I mean, if you have ears and you can hear, and if you have a nose and you can smell, and you have eyes that can water, when you were standing outside in July of 2021 and experiencing wildfire smoke in Minneapolis that was really from thousands of miles away, right, but was so present that you could smell it and it made your eyes water. I think that was a real wake-up call for people. And I don't think it's so much that folks disagree with it, like climate change is happening. And now it's more about like, or is it, it's always too early or too late to do something about a problem, right? Before it was too early. We were not sure that climate change is real, so why would we take action on it? Now, there's actually one of the more in vogue arguments about why not to do stuff on climate change is it's too late, and getting fatalistic about it. I don't think we can accept either of these arguments. And I think that the reality of climate change is something that is becoming more and more apparent to even people who want to be skeptical about it, but they're still not going to adopt the solutions that are necessary just because of that. And so I don't think it's necessary for us to like educate people about the existence of climate change so much anymore as it is for them to understand that there are solutions that are achievable and good and would add value to everyone's life. And so I think it's important both to like make the case for climate change and the reality of it and the climate crisis, while at the same time give people hopeful and solution-based approaches that they can actually get their teeth sunk into and move forward on. All right, let's see if there's any last minute questions. We will not be doing this weekly, Deb, but we will be doing it about bi-weekly. And as what was just said a moment ago, I just want to reiterate what Andrea mentioned, which is that our next webinar will be on the 15th, which is a Tuesday, upcoming at noon as well. We're going to keep this noon time because it seems to work for a lot of people. And we're going to be focused on the SALT bill, and we're going to bring in one of the citizen advocates who's been pushing for this at the legislature for the last 4 years to describe her approach, her journey on this, what she's learned about it, and how you can get involved in pushing for a bipartisan bill that everyone should agree on and that can actually make a difference this legislative session. Otherwise, I just want to also just close by once again thanking all of our donors and supporters. You make this work possible. It allows us to be able to do legislative webinars like this, to be at the Capitol, being monitored, to monitor every session that's important, to make sure that you know what's going on and how you can be involved. So if you are not already a supporter of our work through financial contribution, we'd encourage you to make a donation. Go to mncenter.org, and there's a big donate button at the top right of the screen. So we really appreciate it. You can't miss it. And also there's a big take action button too. So that's another one to keep in mind, is that even if you're like, hey, I want to do something today, go to mncenter.org, go press the take action button and take an action. It'll make you feel better. It'll take you about 3 minutes. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your engagement. We were excited to see so many people involved. We're excited about this legislative session, and we want to make sure that you have all the tools. So let us know what we can do to help. Otherwise, we hope to see you on February 15th at noon, and watch your email box for an invitation for that next webinar. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a great afternoon, and we'll see you soon.